My name is Angela Barlow, and I'm Dean of the Graduate School. And we started hosting the Bear Scholar Seminars last year and have continued that project this year. And we're very excited to have Dr. Candice Barnes joining us for this month's seminar. Dr. Barnes is an associate professor in the College of Education, and she's also the Distinguished Equity Fellow for the college. And so to have her come and talk with us is a blessing. And so I'm going to, without further delay, turn it over to you, Dr. Barnes.
Well, thank you very much. So I'm going to go ahead and just share my screen now so that I'll have that done. Usually there's a tiny bit of lag time, so I want to make sure I get this all done. And then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, there we go. So I wanted to start with just a couple of opening statements before we actually get into the meat of what we're going to talk about today. So typically, and all the time really, I have a lot of wonderful conversations with people who really believe that I will not judge them, right? And I also have wonderful conversations with people who, well, let's see here. I'm not sure why you guys are seeing all of this stuff. I think I just accidentally hit something. So I also have a lot of wonderful conversations with people who recognize that I'll most likely give them my most authentic response. And one such conversation really led me to this particular response. And that is, I really don't hold anyone personally accountable for a history that they did not create, but I certainly hold each one of us accountable for a future that we must create together. And I think part of the issue is we oftentimes don't want to have those very difficult conversations that may illuminate a part of our history that we don't really want to talk about. But we're also oftentimes not putting ourselves in a position to where we question and we ask each other the reasons why we need to dismantle perhaps systems that might be creating oppression or inequities, et cetera. But we're also oftentimes not asking ourselves and each other how we can engage in fostering a sense of hope and a sense of purpose when we are engaging in the shattering, as I call it, shattering the systems. We are certainly responsible, each of us, we're responsible for a future that acknowledges our history, but we are also responsible for reckoning with really a 21st century definition of what that actually means in terms of dismantling, in terms of making sure that we are, again, shattering those systems that are creating a lot of the inequities that we are seeing, not only in our present moments, but we have seen throughout history. It is everybody's job to engage in this kind of action and to also examine our own thoughts and ideologies, our own internalized messages. And so when we do those things, it really does help to dismantle those systems. Otherwise, all of the protests or the demonstrations, and I'm being very specific in protests and demonstrations, not rioting, not any of the other things that are considered more lawlessness, right? But the protests, the demonstrations are, various historical nominations or two-term presidencies of people of color in for example, or you're graduating from college, or you're entering the workforce. All of the firsts and the onlys, those things will continue to trend as symbolic and oftentimes will tend to trend as the exceptions and not the rules, unless we are creating a system where everyone has an opportunity to flourish. We oftentimes, and I think more often than not, really need to take hold of the historical threats to our humanity and also to our desire to create a very different and a more equitable future. We really need to see the strengths in our diversity so that we can get into what, John Lewis calls that good trouble. So this is really especially true for all of us who are living in a country where perhaps we have to deal with some of the scars, some of the legacies of slavery, of seeing people, not allowed to be a part of this American dream. We have to deal with that. We have to come to a reckoning with that. And that means that we have to get to really know each other as people, each other as an individual, each other as a narrative and a history that may be a part of a larger context and a part of a larger group, because we're all human beings. So there are, times in which you may encounter and have conversations with people where the conversations are very difficult, they're very challenging. You may not have a real true understanding of who they are, but the objective in those moments is to decenter self and to make sure that you are listening, that you are really trying to understand that person's history, that person's story, and understand how they fit their personal narrative perhaps into a larger context. And on the flip side of that, we need to recognize that there are folks who have some very internalized messages about who they are, their roles. And some of that comes from the ways in which the systems and the structures have created people who are beneficiaries of and people who are in an oppressive state because of the systems and the structures that exist. So my point in all of this is that each and every person, we all have a narrative, we all have a history, we all have a way of thinking and behaving that can positively and negatively affect the conditions by which we enter and engage in the issues of equity that we want to focus on. We are certainly facing our present moment, and we are also facing our history. And that means that there is an incredible amount of work to do, and we all are implicated in doing that work. And we all need to rely on the good graces, the best practices, and the intentionality of each and every person to do their part. So I say all of that to ask you all and to just impress upon you all to think about what is it that you can actually do to shatter the system. So part of the work that I do within the College of Education as a Distinguished Education Equity Fellow is to really work with the Council of Deans, faculty members, folks in my department, the Elementary Literacy and SPED department, and then also people who are, in other colleges, other divisions, other departments, to really talk about what we're going to do in order to advance and or center equity. And so those two things, centering equity has more to do with the interpersonal reckoning that we all have to do, the challenges that we are all faced, the messages perhaps that we are receiving, and advancing equity has more to do with the actions, the behaviors, the practices and the policies that need to be put in place so that equity can flourish. So centering equity is more about the person. When you're looking for information, you perhaps are examining self, you may perhaps be examining some of your own thinking or ideologies, etc. But then the advancing equity has more to do with the institutional and in many instances, the ideologies. However, if you aren't centering equity in your own life and in your own space, it is going to be very difficult for you to do the advancing of equity. And so again, how are we going to shatter the systems, and how does it actually start with us? And then how does that permeate out into, or how does that expand out into our circles of influence? So I want to just start with this really great quote from James Baldwin. James Baldwin, activist, essayist, he's one of my very favorite people, his historical figures at this point. He has written countless essays and books and, has been the catalyst for a lot of conversations that I have with people. And one of the things that he says about education is this particular quote, that as we begin to examine, as we begin to become conscious, as we begin to receive lots of information, that it is absolutely important that we are examining the society in which we are being educated. So the systems, the structures, all of those things that are the foundation for how we may be entering, exiting, matriculating through our educational experiences, we have to examine those, and we have to be critical and critique those systems, because education, like all other systems, can create advantages and disadvantages, adversities for some and benefit others. So a lot of the times when I'm doing this work, a lot of folks ask me, well, why do we need to have these conversations? And I think that's a really great question that we have to ask ourselves all the time. Why? And then the other part of that is how. So why do we do this? What is our purpose? And then how do we then move forward? So for me, a few of the whys that I want to bring into this particular conversation is a little bit of what I said in the opening, and that is sitting in silence and complacency will continue to create systems that benefit some and create disadvantages for others or adversities for others. And so that's one of the reasons why we have to do this work, why we need to impress upon each other to do the work. Another reason why is that, again, we perhaps may not hold each other accountable for the history that we didn't create, but we certainly need to hold each other accountable for a future that we build together. And we can do things together. We need to figure out what that looks like, but we also need to recognize that there is a history. There are some underpinnings that may create some barriers to how we actually begin to build out those communities and build a better future or a different future that we all want to see. And then we are all implicated in doing this work in order to create substantive policies and practices and the actual and the real change, not just the lip service, but the real change. We are all implicated in doing the work, and none of us are inoculated. We are all accountable, and we should all be holding not only ourselves, but each other accountable for doing that substantive work. So I want to start with a little bit of a conversation starter around education. Feel free to add, some thoughts that perhaps are resonating with you in the chat, because I do want this to feel as much of a conversation as possible. But one of the things that, or one of the books rather that I've read recently is by Daryl Wingsu. It's called Race Talk and the Conspiracy of Silence. And in the book, he talks about this idea of power imposition. And in education, one of the things that we need to realize, and I'm sure many of you do realize, is that when you are thinking and examining the practices and the policies in education or the educational system, you all probably recognize, as I do, that there are some flaws, that there are some ways in which the educational system is not equitable, where it is not fair, just, or impartial, right? And that is what we are looking for and what we really need to push forward when we're talking about education equity. But in the book, he talks about this idea of power imposition. And so those who are in positions of power, whatever that looks like in education, that there's a pathology of power imposition. There's a pathology that pushes forward this idea that people need to assimilate into whatever the majority culture is. Oftentimes it is a white dominated culture. It is created oftentimes by people who are in these positions of power that create the standards for how everyone else in education should act and behave, how we should think, what it looks like. The pathology also really informs oftentimes or affects and influences the ways in which people are pushed into certain programs, into certain sports even, and who's supported, who's not supported by faculty. How do we think about certain people based on their obvious characteristics, their race, ethnicity, who they love, how they live. All of those things, oftentimes, that kind of ideology is really pushed forward through this whole concept of power imposition. He also talks about this idea that power imposition really can influence in many ways your career choices, the ways in which you are stereotyped or the stigmas that may be attached to you because of your loved experiences or even your appearance. As an African-American woman who wears her hair in its natural state, I know that there might be certain situations where my natural hair is not considered professional, and as a matter of fact, there are laws now, there's just been laws passed that say I cannot be and should not be discriminated because of the way in which I wear my hair. So those kinds of things oftentimes can impact, can influence, can affect the ways in which we are engaging with each other, the language that we use, code switching, our cultural agility, all of those things because of this concept of power imposition. So I want to just let that sit with you all for just a moment. Feel free again to add any comments into the chat. Now, while I might not be able to get to all the comments in the chat, I just want to give you guys a little bit of an opportunity to have just to add your thoughts, what's resonating with you, perhaps even if you're seeing some of implications of power imposition in your own, in your world that may even have shaped your thinking. So as you guys are kind of sitting with that, and that might be rolling around a little bit for you, I want to offer another piece of information or another narrative, something that you might actually connect with, or something that you may have heard before. So again, in Race Talk, Darwin Sue provides this particular passage, and it's a very interesting passage about the whole idea of color blindness. And it's something that we've heard, and especially if you work in a diversity, equity, inclusion space for a very long time, there's always a lot of discussion around color blindness, and the whole idea of I don't see color. So one of the things that he talks about in the book Race Talk is about this idea of color evasion having two purposes: one, aspirational, and an aspirational goal that is intended to reduce prejudice and discrimination. That's the concept, the idea, the whole idea of I don't see color is really about color evasion. And then the second, representing the beliefs in sameness. So we're all the same under the skin. What research has shown over the last few years is that when we start to internalize that message of color blindness, it really is not helping any of the social justice or the social equity platforms move forward into our own existence, or we're not internalizing and we're not actually doing anything because we have adopted this whole idea that we don't see color. And as a matter of fact, what research now says is that once you begin to adopt that as your thinking, your thought process, and you've internalized that message, that you are in many ways dismissing and or negating a part of a person's identity who may have a certain story, a narrative, a history that speaks to their race or ethnic grouping or ethnic identity, and the way all of those things perhaps intersect for them. The whole idea for me that I find really interesting is that once you begin to allow, and I'm using the word allow because it is, you're making a choice to receive someone's story as their true, authentic representation of themselves. It is very hard to be dismissive of who they are. And so that whole idea of color blindness is really something that we really should shift away from, and give people space and opportunity to tell their true, authentic story. So I want to just offer just a little bit of silent reflection for you all. I think there's some comments going on in the chat, and while I can't necessarily see those right now, I do want to just give you all a moment for some silent reflection to think about things that might be resonating with you, or if you have any trepidations or tensions that you might be feeling, or if any of what I've said so far has ignited an interest in you. And hopefully I'll have an opportunity to come back to those during the Q&A, and I can then read some of your comments in the chat. But I just want to give you all a moment for that. So the frame that I want to offer you all today as we continue this conversation really comes through the idea of diversity science and a little bit of critical race theory. Diversity science is a concept that has, it's an emerging concept. The salient researcher in diversity science is Victoria Plout. And in her work, she defines the idea or the concept of diversity science, and we'll talk about the 3 ways in which she's actually done that. And she brings into the space a different way to think about diversity. So oftentimes when we think about diversity as, we think about all these various categories of diversity. And while diversity absolutely is representational and it speaks to equality, over the last few years, diversity has in some ways began to trend as symbolic. And what Victoria Plout and other folks who do a lot of diversity science research, what they believe is that we really need to shift the way we think about diversity and think about it from a social science perspective or as a social science phenomenon, because that allows you to see the whole person. That allows you to see the complete narrative of someone and accept that their story is an authentic representation of who they are. There's a little video that I think I should be able to play this. It's a video, what Beyonce taught me about race. Now, here's the thing. It's not Beyonce. The narrator is Brittany Barron, but she talks about Beyonce's halftime show. And so this is a very, very short TED Talk, and we're not going to watch the whole thing. But in the TED Talk, she talks about these 3 concepts that I thought were really phenomenal. One is about the 10,000 hour rule and how that really can apply to education equity. And then how we begin to internalize messages about roles and status, which will then kind of lead us into the next part related to diversity science. And what does that actually say about who we are and how we engage and interact with each other, and or how we are interacting even with students. So I'm gonna make sure my
So the year was 1999. I was 13 years old. The location, a sleepover with all of my best girlfriends. The occasion, well, the new Destiny's Child album, The Writings on the Wall, had just come out. And we felt like listening to it for an entire night on repeat was the only way to mark such a glorious occasion. And since that fateful day in 1999, my love for Beyonce has only gotten stronger. And I know I am not the only one. And yes, shout out to the Beehive. And if you don't know who Destiny's Child is, this was the girl group that Beyonce was a part of before she started her solo career. And since then, Beyonce has grown to be one of the best artists of our time. With over 100 million records sold, she's won 20 Grammys. She's become the most nominated woman in Grammy history. She has sold out world tours. She has more statistics and has broken more records than I'm going to use for my entire time today. But Beyonce is a woman at the top of her game, and America has loved her. And on February 6, 2016, Beyonce released a new single, Formation, complete with a music video and a next day Super Bowl halftime performance. Now, most of us are familiar with Beyonce. We've heard her music, we've seen her perform either live or on TV. But this was a different Beyonce. We saw her paying homage to the Black Panthers at the Super Bowl. We saw her standing against police brutality in her Formation video. And this is one of the first times where we didn't see Beyonce singing something like Bootylicious or Single Ladies. And a lot of people didn't like it. The critics came pouring in, and I realized something. America's reaction to Beyonce highlighted a much more subtle, more nuanced issue we have in our country. See, we like Beyonce when she's singing Bootylicious or Single Ladies because she's sassy, she's sexual, and she is a stereotype of what we want Black women to be. But when she shows a less monolithic character of herself, and ultimately of Black women, we didn't like that as much. And now we're in a space and time in our country where racial tensions are high. People are protesting, people are polarized. And what we see every day on our social media feeds and on the news are people standing on extremes of every side of this issue. But I want to argue that a lot of America's problem with race comes from a smaller, more invisible form. Sometimes, I think when we talk about race, a lot of us can think about slavery or former civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. or Rosa Parks. And it feels like a reality of the distant past that has little to do with how we live our everyday lives today. And I want to disagree, and here's why. So Terrence Roberts, he's one of the Little Rock Nine. They were the first 9 students to integrate the Little Rock school system. Well, he talks about a principle that social psychologist Malcolm Gladwell highlights in his book Outliers, except he frames it around race. In the book Outliers, Gladwell talks about something called the 10,000-hour rule. And the 10,000-hour rule is this. If you spend 10,000 hours intentionally practicing something, you become an expert on that thing. But here's the catch. Once you become an expert in something, about 70% of that action gets relegated to your subconscious. You've put in the hours, you've done it enough, and it becomes sort of automatic. For example, if you were to ask gold medal gymnast Simone Biles how she jumps on a 3-inch beam, does a no-handed cartwheel, 4 flips off the back, and lands squarely on her feet, how she does it, she'll only be able to give you about 30% of that answer. Why? She's put in her 10,000 hours, she's become an expert, and when she gets on the beam, her body knows what to do. It becomes automatic. Okay, so what does any of this have to do with race? Well, I want to give you some dates. The first is 1619. 1619. This represents the year that the first Africans were brought to the US as slaves. The second date is 1954. 1954 is the year of Brown versus Board of Education. This is the case that was meant to desegregate our country. Now, for the sake of this example, let's assume that in 1954, our country integrated and everything was great. We know that that's not the truth, but just track with me. So 1619 to 1954. This represents a span of 335 years. Now, for these 335 years, our country intentionally practiced the dehumanization of, the abuse of, the exploitation of, and the segregation from Black people in this country. For those 335 years, Black people were owned as property, were refused citizenship, were treated as less than, were bought and sold as commodity, used for entertainment, and disregarded. Now, if you're wondering how that time breaks down, those 335 years represent 294 10,000-hour units. So our country became an expert 294 times on the dehumanization of, the oppression of, the abuse of, and segregation from Black people in this country. Now remember, once you become an expert in something, 70% of that action gets relegated to your subconscious. So if we look around and we ask ourselves, why are racial tensions still so high? Why are so many parts of our country still so segregated? What is going on? If we trust our automatic responses, we'll only be able to give you about 30% of that answer. Now, assuming that in 1954, when legally some things changed, we've only even been trying to do something different for 62 years. Okay, so back to Beyonce. What does any of this have to do with Beyonce? Well, Beyonce is a Black woman in America. A country that has become an expert on expecting certain things from people who look like Beyonce. They have been our entertainers.
So I'm going to stop the video right here because I think, you guys certainly can watch the rest of it on your own, but I think you all get to the point here in terms of not only the 10,000-hour rule and how long it takes to internalize messages, and perhaps it's part of the reason why we're not able to answer the question of why and how and what's actually happening, because we've only been doing something different for a very short period of time. And this was actually a TED Talk that was presented in 2017. but it is still, even in 2020, what she's saying is quite relevant to our present moment. And so there's all of these ways in which we internalize roles and status and expectations of who we are to each other, who we are as individuals, and who we are in our own skin. And so it's a really great way to segue into the whole idea of diversity science. And as I said before, diversity science is really introduced in 2009 through Victoria Plout's work. And since then, there's been many other people who have talked about diversity science and seeing diversity from a little bit different perspective. And so I actually like to call it the idea of the detoxing what we currently understand diversity is, and thinking about various ways in which we are diversity science is emerging. And so there are three specific things that I want to give you all related to diversity science, or three things that I really want to download into this particular conversation. One is how diversity science is understood. So through Plout's work and others, diversity science looks at the ways in which our human differences are constructed and the ways in which our human differences are structured. And what the research says about the intersection of both the construction and structure has to do with the ways in which the construction part happens is through our social and our cultural context, and then the structured part happens to be our psychology, or through our psychological and our biological parts of ourselves and domains. And so when you have this intersection of both the constructed and the structured, we're talking about a whole being, we're talking about a whole person. Oftentimes what happens, according to a lot of the research, is when we're only thinking about diversity from the constructed perspective, we are dismissing the ways or the experiences, the ideas, who a person is, the psychology, the biological parts of all of their, the intersection of all of their identities. So it's really the combination, again, allowing space for someone to tell their complete story. What is so important about diversity science from my perspective is someone gets to tell you their story. You don't get to tell someone else their story through your very narrow lens of experiencing perhaps, or having some encounters with someone who looks like them, or someone who loves like them, or someone who has a certain identity. The second thing I want to just bring into the conversation about diversity science is this whole idea that it allows for more inclusive attitudes and for this whole sense of belonging to emerge. Now, the Disruptive Educational Equity Project, the founder of that project is Dr. Darnisa Armonte Jackson. And in her continuum, what she talks about and what she brings into many conversations is a continuum that moves from diversity to belonging to inclusion to equity. Equity being last because equity is a little bit more difficult to achieve, and it usually takes a very long time in order for a group or an institution to achieve true equity. Oftentimes what happens is equity and diversity are conflated, and we think we're doing equity work when we're really just doing diversity work. The equality, the representation, or even the symbolism, the first, the onlys, the tokenizing may often be a little bit more of that diversity or even pre-diversity work, and not really equity, because again, equity is about dismantling the systems and the structures so that we can create impartiality, fairness, and justice. But when we're looking at diversity science and we're looking at that whole, the construction and the structured parts of people and how their intersecting identities tells a really strong, complete, authentic narrative of who they are. And then they're offering that into a very safe space. And then there's opportunities for you to engage in an understanding, a level of awareness and appreciation about all of their various experiences. That really speaks to more of those inclusive attitudes and the belonging. Belonging is not about greeting someone. It is not about being civil so long as you get what you want. Belonging is about a person feeling welcomed and feeling included and feeling a part of an environment, not just because of their diversity, but just because of their true being. And then the last thing, and I really want to offer into the conversation, because I want to have plenty of time for some questions that you all may have. Diversity science really looks at the ways in which we are internalizing messages. And this is probably one of the most important parts of diversity science that really settles with me. The ways in which we are internalizing messages and accepting people's narratives about who they are as a part of a certain group or who they are individually. It also exposes the ways in which we see each other through our own narrow perspectives and through our own very oftentimes limited encounters. But when we are engaging in true diversity science, it really does help create opportunities for more intergroup relationships. And it does not allow for us to limit ourselves and to limit the work that we're doing with equity. So again, if we're looking at diversity and then belonging, inclusion, and then equity, we're moving along this continuum and we're doing so in a way that allows us to really have some very rich conversations and discussions about who we are individually and who we are as a part of larger groups, so that we have some intergroup relationship, intergroup relatedness that speaks to our rapport, the ways in which we respect and value our humanity or the humanity that surround us, the decency, the dignity, and even our humility, which speaks to our freedom of arrogance, our freedom of assumptions about other people or acidic commentary about other people, because we're seeing a person as a whole being. They're constructed parts of themselves that are intersected with their structured part of themselves. So diversity science really asks you to explore several different questions and a lot of how questions, a lot of how and why questions. So how have all of your experiences really shaped your thinking, action, and behavior towards others? When we talk about the messages that we've internalized and we talk about the ideologies that we're bringing into a conversation or we're bringing into I like to use the phrase downloading something, an ideology into the conversation or into a discussion, we have to examine those that thinking and or our behavior and then our action. And our action does not necessarily mean that it's something negative, but certainly our action can be, what are we actually doing to be supportive of, to be a help to someone else? And then so how do all of those experiences really shape our thinking, action, and behavior? Another question that diversity science asks us to really examine and to really think about and grapple with is, how are we actually holding someone's background as the true, authentic representation of who they are? Do we really accept that a person's experiences are theirs, or do we dismiss it because we don't want to hear how they may be having a negative experience because of the way in which they have intersected or talk about their identity, or something has happened to them because of an identity? Do we not want to hear that? Do we dismiss that? I would say that sometimes that happens. I hear it a lot. Oh, you shouldn't think that way. Oh, I'm sure that person didn't mean it that way. But it really is that then when you do those kinds of things, you are centering yourself in a conversation, when in actuality, what you need to do is decenter yourself so that you can truly hear that person's history. It goes back to the whole idea of power and position, what role, the expectations, the standards, the status that someone has. It's not dependent upon you, and it shouldn't be. But when you are entering a conversation or you are in a conversation and you dismiss that person's narrative, their history, and their experiences, then that's exactly what you may be doing. Diversity science also asks that you challenge yourself to deepen your understanding about self and others. Now one thing that comes into play here is the idea of cultural humility. The examination and the discovery of self and others, and how all of that information allows you to have that really strong intergroup relatedness. Cultural humility, from my perspective, can really be intersected with civility. And again, not civility, the niceties and the gestures, but when we intersect cultural humility and civility, what we're talking about is the ways in which our thinking, action, and behavior respects and values humanity. It is that intersection of those two concepts that really speaks to the ways in which we are constantly examining and challenging ourselves to really understand ourselves and then also understand others. The part about understanding self has to do with the ways in which you are examining your own thinking. You may be engaging in some debiasing types of strategies and activities. You may be diagnosing your own issue of equity. You might even be decoupling your thinking from some sort of ideology that is wholly untrue about an individual or an individual as a part of a larger group. And then diversity science also asks you to, how your views are either your own views, how those views are constructed, and how you can challenge the source that has helped shape some of these perspectives and views. Now, here's where a lot of the trepidation comes into play. Because when you are challenging the source of some of your own thinking, action, behavior, ideology, that may also mean that you are challenging a person. You might be challenging a particular belief. You might not necessarily be challenging a value, or you may. And sometimes that creates this shield of protectionism, because we want to protect those values and those belief systems that has really shaped us into being the person that we are. Here's the thing about that. Sometimes you need to challenge those sources. Sometimes you need to engage other perspectives and really make sure that you have a real, true, authentic understanding about a person, or about who they are as a part of a larger social group, or who they are as a part of a larger demographic group, and then how all of those things are intersected for them, their story. But that may mean that you are challenging the source of some of those behaviors, and that's okay. The thing about protectionism is that it comes with this sense of loss. You're going to lose something. I'll offer this to you. When you are challenging the source, perhaps, of some of your ideologies, or even challenging the source of the internalized message about who you are, the roles that you play, your expectations, the status that you have in society, in the country, etc., you're not going to be losing as much as you will actually gain, because you're going to gain a greater understanding, a broader context, a real, true, real, just, I don't even know how to say it, just a real authentic view of yourself and of other people. And that is something that is far greater than perhaps something that you think you may lose. The whole idea with power and position and how it kind of situates within diversity science is this, when you think about power and position and who puts these boxes down that we all have to kind of fit into, the idea of that is, when you think about diversity sciences, you can kick those boxes down and say, I'm not going to be in any box. I want to figure out what's actually going on. I want to see and understand who an individual is, and how do I actually engage with them? Who is this person that I'm having this encounter with? And that's the beauty of diversity science.